Well, hello there. Welcome to My Life as a Landlord. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen, and I'm so excited for you educating yourself by listening to this podcast. As a landlord, there are times to move fast, and then most of the time you won't move fast at all. So let's talk about some of the times that you do need to move fast. Like when there's an emergency, when there's a water leak reported, when there's a great tenant who's applied for your unit, and when days for proper notice matters in serving your tenants, whether it's for evictions, notice of entry, or when your tenant needs to give you proper notice as well. But let's talk about when there's an emergency, especially when it involves water. I always tell our tenants, if you want to see us run, tell us you have a water leak. We will come running. That is a drop everything and go running item. That is definitely something you want to check out. But when we talk about emergencies, let's expand into when a tenant is over reporting. Let's talk about this. So let's talk about when a landlord needs to move. Let's talk about when a landlord doesn't need to move. But how do you wade through the stream of communications, especially if you have a tenant who is a chronic complainer? And there are tenants out there that over report. I get it. How do you know what's important and how not? I see lots of this on the Facebook groups about landlording, of people, receiving text messages and emails. I'm on many websites, podcasts, social media groups, and I see so many comments about communication with tenants, and especially when tenants overly communicate with the landlord. So what do you do as a landlord when you have a tenant, usually someone who just moved in? They're usually in there less than a month or so. They're texting, calling, emailing, all kinds of things, steady stream of comments, complaints, suggestions. Is that a time when you have to move fast as a landlord? I don't know, but we're going to figure it out. And when that tenant is over reporting, there's one word to summarize it: awkward. When you're self-managing your units as a landlord, you may quickly grow to cringe when you hear that text alert sound, or maybe your anxiety speaks. Maybe you become uneasy when your email receives a note, or simply put your notifications on silent. Again, awkward. In today's podcast, I'm going to help you educate on what the different levels of repair are, how to gauge what the repairs are, and what to do if a tenant doesn't stop over communicating with you. But when, as a landlord, do you move fast? That's the key on this one. So if you've been listening to the show, you know that I specialize in awkward conversations. Further, I find awkward conversations as quickly as possible because they get bigger and worse all the time until they become all consuming and there's all you can think about. So let's talk about how to address when tenants are constantly talking to you as the self-managing landlord. Okay, so when to move fast as a landlord, let's just take a sidebar for a second on when a tenant is over communicating, because I see lots and lots of comments of this. Sometimes what the tenant is communicating, you may need to move fast on this, but sometimes you don't. In fact, I would bet that most of what this tenant that's over communicating with you is complaining about is usually aesthetics. It has nothing to do with safety. Now, remember, as a landlord, that's the main thing, is you want to keep things safe in your unit for this tenant, comfortable, not noisy, things like that, right? So if they're talking about a scratch in the countertop, make a note on the condition inspection saying that they didn't, that we know that they didn't do that, and move on, right? Okay, so one thing you can do to avoid having all this over communication and not know what to do is set up a system that you as the landlord know what you to do, and that the tenant also knows what to do. And this should be in your lease, I think. Have a method to make your trouble calls, usually either sending an email or texting one of the team, not you, and put in your lease different levels of repair. Okay, emergency, we're going to talk about that here in a second. That's when you move. Urgent and convenient. Okay, emergency repairs is something that you must drop everything and deal with: sewer line breaking, water leak of any kind, tree falling on the house, fire, flood, smoking, anything requiring police emergency fire, even if they occur at 2 a.m. That's something that needs to be addressed pretty quickly. An emergency repair is involving imminent damage or safety for either the tenants in the unit or both, and you have got to move quickly. Okay, so then let's talk next about an urgent repair. Urgent repairs are those that must be dealt with immediately. But if they recur at 2 a.m., that they can wait until the next day, but they still have, excuse me, they still have to be fixed. Examples of this are a refrigerator stopped working, there's a bear in the yard, bathtub not draining, light bulb in a common staircase is burned out. An urgent item is something that is not necessarily an imminent safety item, but it is not, sorry, let me say it again. An urgent item is something that is not necessarily an urgent safety item. One more time. An urgent item is something that is not necessarily an emergency item, but if it's not corrected imminently, it will cause either a safety issue or damage over time to the unit. That's what makes it urgent. Okay, so that's an urgent repair. A convenient repair is where a burner on the stove needs to be replaced. A door needs to be aligned better because it squeaks, or maybe it rubs, or it doesn't latch just quite properly. Something that is not a safety item, not imminently causing damage to the unit, it's what I consider convenient. Also things like maybe not a leaky faucet. A leaky faucet would be something that we want to make sure that if it's leaking, not into the sink, but if it's leaking on the counter or underneath, that's something that needs to be addressed pretty quickly. But a convenient repair, towel bar comes down, you know, some of that stuff, that is not a drop everything item, right? So the whole idea of this podcast is, when does a landlord move fast, and when is the tenant, even if the tenant is over reporting, there are still things that you have to move fast for that. Okay, so back to the tenant who is over communicating. Out of the items that they are reporting, are there any emergency related to the tenant or the safety of the unit? Safety of the unit. If not, they shouldn't be communicating with you incessantly. Out of the items that they are reporting, are any of the items going to cause damage or urgent repairs, issues with the unit? If they are complaining about scratches in tile, make a note on the condition inspection and move on. I have had tenants over report before, and I simply respond, my job is to make sure that you are safe and that your unit is quiet and comfortable. A scratch in the countertop is not something that we're going to fix. It's just not. It's something that we're going to note that you did not do the damage, but it's part of the aesthetics in your unit. We've had people complain about not having enough natural light in the unit. They want us to knock out a wall and put in a window. Well, that's not happening either. The unit is the way it is. If it's not working for you, you know, I've offered to people before many times and say, you know what, if you're not comfortable in this unit, please give us proper notice. I will let you out of your lease, even if they've signed a year lease. If they are going to stress me out, if they're going to stress the team out, and they are going to over report, it's better to let them move on to somewhere that they're going to be more comfortable. And it could be for any reason, right? It may not be the actual item that they're reporting. Maybe for something else. You never know. So, okay, back to this tenant who's over communicating. Out of what they are reporting, is there anything that's your duty to fix as a part of the move-in? Some of it is. Sometimes when you're doing a move-in, you go, you know what, I am going to replace the blinds. I am going to, you know, update the smoke detector, or whatever it may be. The other thing is that out of the normal wear and tear in the unit, is that something that they are reporting, or is that something they're reporting an existing condition? Maybe they didn't note it during the walkthrough. You know, this is why when we do our condition inspections, we do a written notice, because that is almost what is required for nearly all state, province, and territories. Is it's got to be in writing. Even if you take a video, even if you take pictures, that's great, but typically they want it in writing. And so we typically do both. I've done both lots and lots of times, where if there's any issues, a tenant during the initial walkthrough, they walk through and say, hey, there's a question here. Perfect. I note it on the condition inspection form, and then I also take a photo of it, so we have it. So there's a before and an after. Now, if you're saying, Jen, where do I get a condition inspection form? You can Google condition inspection form for your state, province, or territory, or sometimes if you do not have a pre-made form in your location, you can get one. I get one from British Columbia. British Columbia has an amazing amount of pre-made forms, but they're not the only ones. There's plenty of templates that you can use. Again, there's no required forms, typically not specific forms. It just has to be in writing. But make sure you are checking your local tenancy or residential housing act or tenancy code, whatever is required in your area. You need to make sure. If it's not specific on what form you have to use, you literally can use any form you want. Typically, I will steal one from British Columbia. I can white out the British Columbia aspect or any of the British Columbia contact information, especially if I'm using it outside of British Columbia. I've done this for some of my rentals in Hawaii before, but again, it's in writing, so it actually foots the bill, which is good. Okay, so if your tenant is over communicating, if there is some things that you need to deal with, or even if there is not, so if the tenant is simply just still complaining, I have absolutely no problem just letting them know. So how do you get a tenant to stop over communicating? Here's this one of the things that we need to talk about here. In your lease, put the 3 different levels of trouble calls: emergency, urgent, or convenient, which I do. I have that in my lease addendum. 2, establish a method for the tenants to report these items of concern, whether it's a call, an email, a text, a portal on a website. What do you do in case of an emergency? And you can even include emergency hours. If the tenant is not respecting these emergency hours and they're reporting things that are not safety items to these emergency numbers, you can simply say, look, you need to adhere to our hours, or this is really going to be a problem with communicating. And if it starts this trend, this is where I gladly will essentially let them out of their lease, because if it's stressing everybody out, that's just not going to work. Okay, 3, remind the tenant that you're here to provide a safe, quiet, comfortable space, and reporting non-safety items or items that need urgently repaired really shouldn't be reported during via an emergency method. And if they still don't stop over communicating, you can consider offering them to leave their lease early. We've talked about this. Again, you have permission to fire your tenants, but you also have to do it properly. And sometimes they want to move on, but they're not going to tell you the real reason. They just want to move on, which is fine. Okay, one other thing I'm going to throw in here, one last thing. Look very carefully at your tenant screening before you qualify a tenant and sign a lease with them. If they are already over communicating with you as a tenant, as a potential tenant, sorry, wait a minute, let me say it again. If they are over communicating with you as a tenant, meaning you've already moved them in, chances are good, if you reflect back, they were probably doing this before they became your tenant. Remember, how someone does anything is how they do everything. So next time, if the tenant is over communicating during the application process, this is exactly what they're going to do during the tenancy. Keep that in mind, okay? All right, so that's if a tenant is over communicating. When do you move fast? Basically in an emergency situation, which we'll talk more about, but here's another reason to move fast as a landlord. When there is a great potential applicant who has applied for your unit, a great applicant. When you get an application, you need to go quick. And I mean, oh my goodness, quick. You need to call references, verify IDs, confirm pay stubs with the employer, and with the number from the employer's website, not from the pay stub necessarily. I have seen faked pay stub, faked bank statements, faked IDs, expired IDs. This is something that you need to dig for the deal breakers, for the false information as quickly as you possibly can. If you're not finding that, guess what? Chances are you have found a good applicant, which means you need to move fast. Chances are also good that they are not only applying for your unit, they're applying for multiple. And if another landlord beats you to it, you are very likely going to miss out on this great tenant. This is why you need to move fast as a landlord when you have an application. So when you receive an application, you need to go very quickly, figure out if this is a good applicant or not. Let's see. Yes, these good applicants are likely be in high demand, and your communication with them and their response time needs to be quick. Otherwise, when you do get around to checking their credit, checking their references, etc., they will very likely have already taken another place. This is another time that time matters as a landlord when you want to get tenants in. Besides, you don't want to have your unit sitting empty any longer than it needs to be. If you've got great tenants and you've got an empty unit, if there's an application in play, stop everything and deal with that application. And if it is a great application, move even faster. You want to get great tenants in. Another instance when time matters as a landlord is the timing for service of service documents to your tenant. This is very geographic dependent. Where you are dictates how much time you have to give notice for things like entry for inspection or repairs, entry for showing, and most of all, service of documents. You must know these dates in your area, and they vary wildly. Where do you find them? Your local tenancy act or some kind of requirement for housing, state, province, territory. Some locations even further have requirements for county, regional district, or some by city like New York City. You must know these rules. You must know what the timing is, and it does matter. Timing does matter in this. If you don't know them or you're not sure what to do, simply Google your location with the words tenancy housing. For example, if you're in New Jersey, Google New Jersey tenancy housing, and the website for New Jersey Housing Resource Center pops up with lots of resources. Further, in Manitoba, Google Manitoba tenancy housing and the residential tenancy branch. Province of Manitoba comes up with tons of resources of what you need to do if you're a landlord or a tenant. Now, there are also time requirements that are in the Tenancy Act that include requirements for fixing repairs that have been reported properly. So, for example, in the state of Hawaii, a landlord has a certain amount of days to do a repair, but this also requires proper notice to the landlord in writing for the work that needs to be done. So that it goes both ways, but it all goes down to the very basics. You have to know the rules of the game. And this is really where you've got to sort through the awkward conversations with your tenant. You've got to know the game of your local, where your rentals are, not where you are, but where your rentals are, and when to move fast, honestly. So in today's really quick podcast, I reviewed when time matters as a landlord, when there's an emergency, especially when a tenant is over reporting, when there's a water leak reported, when there's a great tenant who's applied for your unit, and when you need to give proper notice or things like doing repairs. There is a time when time matters as a landlord. It's very important that you know what time requirements are on you. If you enjoyed today's show, the biggest compliment you can give me is by leaving a review so people who need my podcast can find me. Remember, you don't have to be afraid as a landlord. You just have to educate yourself. Join me next week for episode 92, where Axel Meyerhofer talks about real estate and mentoring. I'll see you there. Thanks.